Hello, my name is Mary Black. I'm the GPRA coordinator for the Wayne State University evaluation team overseeing GPRA data collection for the State Opioid Response 2 grant in the state of Michigan. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of the GPRA data collection process from intake through 6-month follow-up. Today's presentation is a 5-part presentation. Part 1 is the GPRA implementation overview, which is really just the nuts and bolts of what the GPRA interview process entails. We'll talk about GPRA and Qualtrics and how to enter your data into the Qualtrics web link. We'll discuss some considerations for special populations. And we'll also provide an overview of the 6-month follow-up tools we have to facilitate your 6-month follow-up interview efforts. And then we'll finally discuss very briefly what to do if you can't conduct one of the GPRA interviews. I'll note briefly before we begin this presentation that all resources that I reference throughout the presentation are available at mygiprainfo.org. That's MIGPRAINFO.org. That's our Wayne State University dedicated website, Wayne State University website dedicated to all things state opioid response to and GPRA. So part 1, GPRA implementation overview. To begin, what is GPRA? So GPRA is actually an acronym for the Government Performance and Results Act that was first established in the early 90s. It's also the term we use for the established client outcome instrument to measure the performance of government funded programs. So that's what SAMHSA's definition is basically of an interview tool. So when we discuss GPRA moving forward, we are specifically referring to one of 3 interview tools: the GPRA intake, the discharge, or the 6-month follow-up. So any client who is receiving SOR2 funded treatment and or recovery services are required to complete a series of GPRA interviews: the intake, the discharge, and the 6-month follow-up. SOR2 SAMHSA guidelines do not require a 3-month follow-up. So the timelines we're really looking for are the intake, the 6-month follow-up, and the discharge. So what programs might that include? GPRA is not required for prevention programming under the guidelines of SAMHSA. So if you are only providing prevention programming, you're not required to submit GPRA data. However, if your clients are receiving any SOR2 funded treatment and or recovery services in a setting that is jail-based MAT, maybe mobile care units, OUD treatment, they are required to submit GPRA data. This list is by no means a finite list. There are several different programming and programs and settings where clients are receiving SOR2 funded treatment and recovery services, in which case they will be asked to complete the GPRA series of interviews. So who is responsible for the interviews? So we know that if a client is receiving those SOR2 funded treatment or recovery services, they will be required to participate in the GPRA interview process. But who conducts those interviews? So the interviewer, is going to be somebody at your agency, a provider staff or volunteer or peer recovery coach that is familiar with the client and that will be providing services to the client. You'll conduct the face-to-face interviews, the intake, the discharge, and the 6-month follow-ups. I'll note, as I do say face-to-face interview, due to COVID-19, SAMHSA has allowed for all GPRA practitioners and providers to conduct their GPRA interviews either over the phone or through video conferencing. So be aware that while the initial SAMHSA requirement for conducting interviews was face-to-face, beginning with in March 2020 and moving forward until further notice, you can do these interviews either on the telephone or on the computer. We do recommend, if you are going to be conducting these interviews, if you're the person responsible for conducting the interviews, to go ahead and download the PDF copies of the intake, the discharge, and the 6-month follow-up from mygiprainfo.org and get familiar with those interview tools. There are some very difficult questions to both ask and answer. The data is confidential, however, and anonymous. However, you are sitting or talking, with this person one-on-one, and some of those questions are of very sensitive nature. We do recommend also that if you are familiar with the tool, you can kind of give your client a heads up that you're about to ask them some difficult questions. For instance, there are questions that ask about history of violence. So you can say, okay, I'm about to ask you a few questions about your history of violence. And also remind your client they have the right to refuse to answer any question on the GPRA for any reason. So that's also a good way to sort of soften the intensity of some of those questions. You also, during the intake interview process, want to let your client know you will be asking them to do a discharge and a 6-month follow-up interview. And SAMHSA has allowed for us to award up to a $30 cash value 6-month follow-up interview incentive. So your clients could earn up to $30 for completing the 6-month follow-up interview. It's always a good idea to give them the heads up right at the intake as well. So once you complete the actual interview, you'll have a PDF copy, a hard copy of your interview tool where you recorded all your answers. What we're going to ask you to do is then log into our Qualtrics web link, and that is go.wayne.edu/GPRA. When you click on that web link, it takes you directly into an online survey tool that looks just like the PDF survey tool. And what you're going to do is just transfer your answers from the PDF hard copy, paper copy that you completed with your client into the GPRA tool. Now, there is a one chance rule issue that comes with entering data into the GPRA web link, and that is you don't have the ability to save your data, walk away and come back and pick up where you left off. So this is why we ask you to conduct the interview with a paper copy and then transfer your answers into the web link. It's because if the web link crashes while you're conducting the interview, you'll have to start the interview over again. And we really don't want to do that because the interviews are very long. So again, that's the process. So a client will come in, you'll determine that they're eligible for the SOR2 funded services. And once that process is initiated, then you'll conduct the intake interview with using a paper copy with the client, either on the telephone, face-to-face, or on video conferencing. After that interview is completed, you'll enter that data into the GPRA web link. And once that GPRA data is entered into the GPRA web link, we will have it at Wayne State University, and that's when we take it over and process all your data. So let's talk a little bit about those interviews themselves. So the intake, when do you conduct an intake? So GPRA is only related to SOR2 funded services. So you'll conduct your intake interview within 48 hours of GPRA program intake. SAMHSA defines that as the first day the client receives SOR2 funded services. So not necessarily the day they intake into your agency or your program, but 48 hours from when they first get their SOR2 funded services, whatever those might be. So for residential programs, you want to get that GPRA intake interview conducted within 3 days of intake or first program services. And for outpatient programs, you want to get it done within the first 4 days. That's because you just don't want to lose the momentum with conducting the actual interview. But again, SAMHSA does indicate best practice is 48 hours within program intake. Program intake is, again, defined by the first day the client received SOR2 funded services. You also have to do this 6-month follow-up interview. So when do you do the 6-month follow-up? The 6-month follow-up due date is determined by the intake interview date. So 6-month follow-up due date is 6 months post-intake date to the day. So if you have a client that intakes on January 1st, their 6-month follow-up due date is going to be July 1st because it's exactly 6 months later. However, SAMHSA does allow for a 3-month, what we call a 3-month follow-up window. And that means you actually have between 5 and 8 months to complete the 6-month follow-up interview. So if your client intakes on January 1st, the 6-month follow-up due date will be July 1st. But they're eligible to complete that 6-month follow-up interview in that 5 to 8 month window. So between June 1st and September 1st is when that client can actually complete that interview. So a little bit of a grace period there, which is very helpful because we know that sometimes at 6 months, people can be very difficult to follow up with. You'll also conduct a discharge interview. So the definition for discharge is similar to that of intake. And that is you'll conduct your discharge interview when your client stops receiving SOR2 funded services, not necessarily when they discharge from your agency. Programs with discharge policies, though, if you're discharging a client from your program, presumably also SOR2 funded services, you can do the GPRA interview at that time. However, programs without discharge policies, so this is also often refers to recovery homes, when clients just move out, but there's no official discharge, a closing out of that client's experience there. You can wait after 30 days have lapsed since the last time they've completed services and then conduct the GPRA interview. But really the hallmark is you want to conduct that GPRA discharge interview on the last time you know they're going to receive those SOR2 funded services. So one thing we like to note, though, is a discharge GPRA may come before the 6-month follow-up GPRA. That's because the sequence and timeline of when clients receive these, receive services and discharge and reach 6-month follow-up is specific to the services they're receiving and sort of where they're at in their treatment and recovery. So we have clients that have come in, they've done an intake, and 48 hours later, they'll discharge from the program, and then their peer recovery coach will follow up with them in another 6 months to conduct that 6-month follow-up interview. We have some clients who are in treatment for 9 months, and so they'll do their 6-month follow-up interview prior to discharge, and then they'll do their discharge interview 3 months later. So again, it's just really specific to the client and the services that you provide. Just know that you have to conduct an intake interview first. If you try to submit a discharge or a 6-month follow-up interview prior to an intake, we can't link it to your client. So please conduct your and submit your intake interviews prior to discharge and 6-month follow-up. And beyond that, we just want to make sure we get all those in. So the 80% compliance rule is something that we'll talk a little bit more about later, but in some, SAMHSA has set an 80% compliance rule, and it's what we refer to at Wayne State as the 6-month follow-up rate. And the rule is set by Congress and set by SAMHSA, and that is that 80% of all individuals who complete an intake must complete a 6-month follow-up GPRA. So that's kind of a lofty number, we know that, but it's a goal to shoot towards. So just know that if you're conducting an intake interview, you will be required to do your very best due diligence to conduct that 6-month follow-up as well. The 80% compliance rule is what determines future funding, and so it's a very important sort of number in terms of tracking GPRA and progress through the grant. So best practices, familiarize yourself with the GPRA interviews before conducting your first interview. As I said, they're very sensitive in nature. And so we just want to make sure we are prepared for the questions that are coming, and you can prepare your client for the questions that are coming. You can find the PDFs of the 3 GPRA interview tools at our website, mygiprainfo.org. There you can also find the web link for data entry and several other resources. We'll remind you too to ask questions as they are written. Being literal can really be your best approach with some of these questions because they are at times difficult to ask. SAMHSA requires us to ask every question. However, you can remind clients they have the right to retain, or they retain the right to refuse to answer any question as well, which sort of helps alleviate some of the pressure of feeling like they need to answer personal questions. And then you also want to explain during the intake process that the client will be asked to conduct the discharge or participate in the discharge and the 6-month follow-up interview, and they could earn up to a $30 cash gift card for completing the 6-month follow-up. So that brings me to the close of part 1. I'm going into part 2, and that's an overview of GPRA and Qualtrics. So what do you do once with all of this PDF data that you have on this hard copy of your interview tool? What you'll do after you've conducted your interview is you'll go to go.wayne.edu/GPRA, click on the link, and you'll come to this introductory page. So this is the first page you see when you open up that link. And what it is just an introductory of some of the acronyms that we use, a reminder to visit our website, mygiprainfo.org, for more information. There's lots of resources that we have available to you there. You can reach out to us at gipra@wayne.edu. It's our dedicated SOR2 GPRA email address, and we will answer any and all questions related to GPRA that you might have. We're going to remind you to print a paper copy of the GPRA tool at the end of this interview or at the end of your data entry, because it's the only opportunity that you're going to have to collect or to save the data you just entered into the system. So like I said, you can't save it and go back and find it again. You also can't go back and find it after you've closed out the survey. So we recommend you download the PDF copy of every GPRA that you enter into the Qualtrics system. And then don't forget, clients retain the right to refuse to answer any question. So after you advance past that introductory page, we're going to go through a series of pages for tracking. And that is so that we know when to send you 6-month follow-up GPRA reminders, so you know when your clients are eligible for their 6-month follow-up. If we have to verify data, if we want to send you more resources that we've developed, actually make this process easier for you. We're gonna take down information about what agency you represent, what grantee you represent, and also your name and your email, which is where we'll start. So please use the email address that you use regularly. We will never send you irrelevant or spam email from our gpra@wayne.edu email address. So anything that you receive to this email is going to be relevant to your GPRA efforts. So we really hope that you use an email address that you'll check on a daily basis. We're also going to ask you for the client ID of your client. So the client ID system was not standardized by SAMHSA. So each agency is developing their own client ID format. There are some rules. One is you have 12 characters, 12 alphanumerical characters that you can use to develop your client ID. You do not have to use all of them. I'm finding a lot of newer agencies are using 4-digit client IDs, beginning at 1 and consecutively going up. There's also lots of combinations with numbers and letters, but keeping them short and simple is your best approach. Also, the client IDs have to be confidential and unique and anonymous. So you can't have any identifying information in the client ID. So social security numbers, names, initials, mother's maiden names, license plates, MDOC, inmate numbers, anything like that cannot be in the client ID. Anything that you can use to Google the client and find them and link them to this record, you can't have in the client ID. So we just recommend something simple like 0001 or something like that. You want to enter the client ID though, and make sure that that is only assigned to one client and that you use that client ID on each of that specific client's interview tools. So if you have client ID 0001 on intake, it needs to be 0001 on discharge and 6-month follow-up. If you enter an intake with 0001 and you enter the discharge as 01, they won't match and we won't find those records. So make sure you're entering them precisely. You're also going to indicate the treatment type or the client type, or is your client in treatment or recovery? That's determined based on the services you provide. You're also going to indicate the interview type, and that is going to tell us how many questions you're going to be asking and which follow-up questions you're going to be asking. So what that does is when you select interview type, it triggers the system to tell us which follow-up questions to ask you. You're also going to indicate the interview date. The interview date is how we will notify or how we will know when to notify you when your client's 6-month follow-up interviews are coming due. So at Wayne State, we do track when 6-month follow-up interviews are due, but we do also recommend that you track them yourselves. So we have data to reconcile against. But we will email you at the email address that you provided in the beginning of the data entry system when your 6-month follow-ups become eligible. We'll ask you to provide that client ID again because it's such an important part of knowing which client is assigned to which GPRA. And we've learned in the past that there are keystroke errors. We really recommend that once you type in the client ID the first time, you copy and paste it into this field just to make sure we're getting it in exactly the right way every time. If your client ID verify field and your initial client ID entry don't match, we will email you to that initial email address and ask you to verify. It's really not a big deal, but you know, it's just nice to kind of keep the process moving forward. So once you get past these tracking sections, you're going to get into the very first sort of GPRA question, and that's the behavioral health diagnosis. There are a couple things about this question to keep in mind. Number one, this is a self-reported question. So the GPRA is not asking you to provide a diagnosis. It's not asking you to dig through medical records and find a diagnosis. It's asking you to ask the client, has the client been diagnosed with any of the following disorders? in which case then you can read the headings to the client and they can indicate yes or no, or don't know, or none of the above apply. You only have to select one primary, one secondary, and one tertiary diagnosis for this whole entire section. So you don't have to do that under every heading, to keep that in mind. So again, you are asking the client if they've been diagnosed or if they're aware they've been diagnosed with any of the following disorders. You only have to select one primary, one secondary, and one tertiary diagnosis, though you can select more than one. And your options for none of the above and don't know are at the bottom of this form. So if the client, if those are the responses, then you're able to enter those as well. So I noted the interview type matters because it determines how many questions that you'll have to answer on the interview tool. So you'll know really the hallmark of this section is that there are quite a few questions on the survey. And so while you will likely not ask all 117 questions on the intake due to skip patterns, meaning your client's responses will determine follow-up questions. So if your client responds they have had no experience with violence in their life, it eliminates 4 follow-up questions. So it really just depends on how your client is answering. It's not often that you're going to ask all 117 questions. But we will note these are quite long, and I've said before they're very sensitive in nature. So we really recommend that you build in about an hour per interview with your clients, just to make sure you have enough time to build rapport, get through the entire tool, address any questions they might have, and so forth. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, you want to save your responses when you enter data into the Qualtrics web link. Once you enter that data into the Qualtrics web link and close it out, this will be the only opportunity that you have to save your data that you just entered. Now I'll note, if you're unable to download this PDF, or if you forget, or if you can't find it, we can go into the back end of the system at Wayne State and get it. So if that does happen, feel free to email us at gpra@wayne.edu, and we're happy to retrieve it for you. I do this all the time for practitioners, for providers, and it's just something that needs to get done occasionally. So don't hesitate if you're not able to download a PDF to let us know, and we'll go get it for you. But we do recommend you keep electronic copies at least of every GPRA that you enter with your client's file, just for verification purposes in the future. Sometimes files get lost. Sometimes we reconcile data against our records. So it's just good to have a record of everything you enter into the Qualtrics system. And then I'm just going to repeat the one chance rule again. I just sort of talked about it. Once you open up the GPRA interview tool, you can't save it and come back again. You have to enter all of your responses in one sitting. And so just be sure when you're entering that data that you're not distracted, that it's not in the middle of a lightning storm, you know, that you'll have time, a dedicated time to get those answers entered. It does not take as long to enter that data into the Qualtrics web link as it does to conduct the interview. So maybe 10 or 15 minutes you want to give yourself for that process. And that's the end of our overview of GPRA and Qualtrics. I'm going to talk very briefly here about what to do with special populations that we have considerations for. And then we'll keep moving through the training. So for peer recovery coaches at FQHCs, urgent care centers, or other primary care settings, and also mobile care units, if any of that applies to you, you might be asking yourself, do I need to conduct an intake GPRA for this client? How do I know? Well, the first question you can ask yourself is, will you see this client more than once? If the answer is no, if you're just providing referral services, if you're providing prevention services, under SAMHSA, you are not required, or under SOR2, you're not required to conduct GPRA. If you answer yes, that you will be seeing this client more than once, ask yourself then, will you have an ongoing service provider relationship with this client? Meaning, are you going to be providing services, recovery or treatment services funded by SOR2 to the client? If that answer is yes, then you will go ahead and conduct the GPRA. They consider an ongoing service provider relationship as treatment under the SAMHSA SOR2 grant. So that is one of the indicators of whether or not you have to conduct GPRA. So just remember again, if you have an ongoing service provider relationship where you're providing treatment or recovery services to a client that are funded by SOR2, you're going to go ahead and conduct those GPRA interviews. Another special consideration is the jail-based program. So I mentioned earlier that best practices for getting that intake interview conducted and entered into Qualtrics is going to be 48 hours. For residential programs, we say 3 days, and for outpatient programs, 4. Recognizing that it's technology access to some facilities and correctional facilities across the state is limited, folks providing or conducting GPRA interviews in jail-based programs or settings have 7 days to actually input that interview data into Qualtrics. So just keeping in mind, they try to be flexible about different populations that we're working with and the timelines that we're working under. But yeah, 7 days for jail-based programs to get your interviews input into the Qualtrics system. And then recovery homes. So a special consideration for recovery homes has to do with the facility improvements. So some recovery homes are eligible to use SOR2 funds to do facility or physical improvements to the recovery home itself. So roof repairs, a new porch, could also be things like new dishes, linens for the beds, tablecloths, anything that sort of enhances the livability of the home. If you use SOR2 funds to purchase those or to make those improvements, all residents or clients living in the recovery home must complete a GPRA regardless of their diagnosis. So that's the end of our special populations considerations. I'm going to talk now about the 6-month follow-up tools. The 6-month follow-up tools are some resources that we've developed to help facilitate your 6-month follow-up efforts. We recognize that for some populations, it's very difficult to locate people after you've provided services after 6 months. So in an effort to facilitate that, we've got some tools available at mygprainfo.org, and we have some processes in place to help facilitate that process. This slide is, again, just a reminder of the 80% compliance rule, why it's so important that we're emphasizing the 6-month follow-up interviews so much. It's because completing 6-month follow-up interviews is what determines future funding. So the first thing that SAMHSA allows for to facilitate the 6-month follow-up efforts is the incentive, which I mentioned earlier. SAMHSA allows for a maximum cash value of $30. In the state of Michigan, the incentive is available. You would connect with your SO2 coordinator, who will then coordinate with the state to get the 6-month follow-up $30 gift card. In the state of Michigan, it comes in the form of a gift card. We also recommend you collect collateral contacts. And so a collateral contact is essentially just somebody that your client associates with in a positive way. So it could be somebody, friends, family, work associates, could be somebody in a faith group or Tom on the bowling league. Just if in the process of providing services, they mention a person that they have a good positive relationship with, ask your client, when I have to conduct my 6-month follow-up with you, and if I'm not able to locate you, could I call Tom from the bowling league to get a hold of you? And if your client says yes, there's a process that you can go through to make sure they feel confident that their information is still going to be protected. And so the first rule for you will be, you want to explain that you will only contact friends, family, and associates after first attempting to contact your client 3 times. So you have to call your client, email your client, knock on your client's door, whatever sort of method of reaching out you want to make, you want to try at least 3 times before you'll contact anybody on their list. So you can't just get on the phone as soon as they walk out the door and set up an appointment or something like that. You have to call your client first. You can only contact people that your client approved. We have a form available on our website, mygprainfo.org. That is the collateral contacts form. And what it has on it is the date the client put the collateral contact on the list, the client contact information or the collateral contact information, and then a place for your client to initial and date the day that they put them on this list. And so that is so that if in 6 months you do contact Tom and your client doesn't remember they said they could, you have some sort of documentation saying, like, look, on January 24th, you said you you put Tom on the list. And so, and also remind your client, they can take anybody off the list at any time as well. It's totally within their control who you contact. And then we're also prohibited by HIPAA guidelines and agency policies, professional ethics, to tell the collateral contacts why you're contacting them. So at the bottom here, we have a little bit of vague language that you could probably use or could very well use, to just sort of gloss over why, that you're just contacting your client, and that you have permission to contact the person you're calling. And if you could just have your client reach out to conduct that interview and just keep it casual and light. That's the best strategy. We also have the interview reminder card. So this is inspired by the 6-month follow-up, or sorry, the dentist follow-up cleaning reminder card. When's your next cleaning? So the way this works is at the intake interview, when the interview is done, you're going to give them the GPRA 6-month interview reminder card. You'll put your information as the contact. You'll put their 6-month follow-up due date window, so that 5 to 8 month window on there, and then your contact information reminding them that they can earn $30 gift card for completing the interview. So the idea is that they put this on their fridge or their wallet, or they find it in their car one day and they're like, oh man, it's July 24th. I could totally earn $30 to sit through this interview. So part sort of giving some incentive and a reminder and sort of empowering your client to take on that interview themselves. And then we also have a 6-month follow-up tracker. So we do, as I noted at Wayne State, track 6-month follow-up due dates, but we also really recommend that you track your own clients' due dates. And so to facilitate that, we have built a tracking form that is very sort of general, but the hallmark is that there are formulas built into it to automatically calculate the 6-month follow-up windows. So when you put the intake interview date in column D, the dates for column E, F, and G automatically populate with the correct dates. The right side of this form is actually a place for you to track your 6-month follow-up contact tracking. And this is for your client and not for the collateral contacts. But as I said, you're required to make 3 good faith efforts to contact your client prior to conducting either administrative discharge or contacting a collateral contact. I'll discuss administrative discharges shortly here, so I hope I didn't throw you off there. But what you'll do is just the first time you try to follow up with them, you called by phone, you weren't able to contact them, and just keeping track of how your contacting was going, and then your resolution will be in column O. Did you complete the interview, and if so, on what date? And if we're not able to complete the interview, when did you submit your administrative discharge? So we have that available for you too to download. I also am more than happy to actually sort of tailor this to your needs at your agency. So if you reach out to me at gpra@wayne.edu and just sort of let me know you're looking for a tracker, a 6-month follow-up tracker, I'm happy to help you build one. So just let us know, and we'll do everything we can to keep the process moving. And so now I've mentioned several occasions now the administrative discharge. The administrative discharge is the term we use for, hey, I couldn't conduct that interview. So we know that this is a very transient population. Unfortunately, we do lose clients to death on fairly often occasions. Sometimes clients move away and we can't find them. Sometimes they're moved off of SOR2 funded services into other funded services, for instance, maybe private insurance services, in which case you stop providing services, you'll do an administrative discharge. So what does that look like? You can't do an administrative discharge for an intake, but you can do one for both a discharge and a 6-month follow-up. If you're going to do one for a 6-month follow-up, you're going to open up that GPRA web link like you normally would, that go.wayne.edu/GPRA, and go into the interview tool. I'm going to come back to this slide in a moment. And what you're going to do is when you get to that section where it says GPRA interview type, you're going to select whether it's a 6-month follow-up or a discharge. And then instead of saying the date that you're conducting the interview, you're going to say no interview completed. And what that does is trigger the system to set up a different set of follow-up questions. So let's say, for instance, you're putting in a 6-month follow-up administrative discharge. You've selected no interview completed. They're going to ask you what the follow-up status is of the client. And so that basically means, why couldn't you conduct this interview? You'll notice that there's options 11 and 12. Those actually aren't in the system anymore. That was sort of a glitch with the Qualtrics system. If you're conducting a 6-month follow-up, it means that you did not complete the interview. So you can't select 11 and 12 for this section. However, all the other answers, located but refused, located but otherwise unable to gain access. Sometimes they're incarcerated, sometimes they're in the hospital. And sometimes they just don't want to do it. And so that's an option as well. That'll also ask if your client is still receiving services. So like I said before, clients can be receiving services from your agency that are not funded by SOR2. And if that's the case with this particular client, you'll just indicate yes, and then that will close out that administrative discharge. If you were going to conduct an administrative discharge for the discharge, after you indicate no interview completed, you're going to see the screen that asks for the discharge status. And the first thing they ask for is, what was the discharge date? Remember, that is the date that the client last received services, not the date that you conducted the discharge interview. Because again, you're conducting an administrative discharge, meaning there is no interview conducted. So they just want to know, when was the last date you gave them, you provided services. And then they want to know if your client graduated or if they were terminated. So there are some cases where, or completed, there are some cases where a client will complete a stay at a recovery home and then move out. And that means their treatment was completed, but that you were never able to do the discharge interview, so you'll conduct the administrative discharge. If a client is expelled from a program, you'll say termination. And if you select termination, then what you're going to get is another list of follow-up questions as to why they were terminated from the program. And again, they can be referred to another program, similar things to the 6-month follow-up administrative discharge. Noting on both sections, there is an other specified option where you can write in any reason why you weren't able to conduct the interview if none of the above apply. The administrative discharge also asks you if you tested your client for HIV. This is just a standard GPRA question, which also marks the end of that administrative discharge entry. So this marks the end of our training. So I want to thank you for your time today. Please excuse any of my verbal gaffes along the way. Oh, I was going to go back. Please excuse this gaffe. I want to note the 6-month follow-up administrative discharge has a depressing effect on the 80% follow-up rule. So if you conduct an administrative discharge, it actually counts against the 6-month follow-up rate. Please keep in mind, though, if you have to conduct one, you have to conduct one. We just want to make sure people aren't defaulting to an administrative discharge if they can't locate clients. So again, make the best good faith effort you can to conduct those 6-month follow-up interviews before submitting an administrative discharge. But if you have to submit one, that's why they exist. So we totally understand that. So that brings me to the close of this training. Forgive me for any verbal gaffes along the way, or slide progression gaffes along the way. Again, you can reach us at gpra@wayne.edu for any of your GPRA related questions, concerns, insights. If you need a PDF, if you made an error and you want me to correct it, anything like that, we're available to you at gpra@wayne.edu. We just ask, whenever referencing a GPRA, you always include the client ID, the interview type, and the interview date of the interview type that you're asking about. I also am going to recommend that if you're at all concerned or anxious about getting into that web link and entering data into the web link, it's actually a really simple process, and you're welcome to put in a test entry. So what you would do for a test entry is just go ahead and open up that link, progress through the survey like you normally would, but when it asks for client IDs, just put in test. And that's way we know at Wayne State that it's not a valid record, and we can go ahead and delete it. So don't put in anything valid. You could put in, hey, Mary Black at Wayne State University, please don't enter this, whatever you want, but just don't put in an actual client ID or interview date, and we'll know that it's a test entry. So, but I do recommend doing that, get some practice, get familiar with the system. There's not anything you can do in that Qualtrics system that can't be fixed. If you do run into problems with it, again, gpra@wayne.edu, and we're there to help you out. We also have several resources at the mygiprainfo.org website. That's everything SOR2 GPRA that we have available to help support your GPRA efforts. Anything you can't find there and you're looking for, again, gipra@wayne.edu should be your default. Anything you need GPRA, you can contact us there. So that brings me to the actual close of the training. My name is Mary Black. I'm the GPRA coordinator for the Wayne State University evaluation team overseeing SOR2 GPRA data collection. And so I am going to be your kind of frontline help moving forward. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and good luck and Godspeed moving forward. Have a wonderful day.